President.
The Senator from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to discuss a particular amendment, perhaps a couple of amendments on the Farm Bill, specifically the amendments to the sugar portion of this. You know, there are a number of titles. This is a big, complicated bill, and there's a great deal of discussion about the many reforms that are contained in this bill. But there's one very glaring exception, one huge program that has no reforms whatsoever in the underlying bill. And it just so happens to be, in my view, one of the most egregiously flawed programs in the entire agricultural sector, maybe in government as a whole. It's the sugar program. This is a program which systematically forces American consumers to pay much more than the global price for sugar. It's a huge transfer of wealth from consumers, including the poorest American consumers, to a handful of wealthy sugar producers. It is completely wrong. It is ill-conceived in the first place, and it is perpetuated in this bill, and I think that's just unconscionable. Some of the specific ways in which the existing program has the government completely manipulating the market for sugar include explicit limits on how much sugar can be produced domestically. There's a de facto government-imposed price floor on sugar rather than allowing the price to reflect whatever supply and demand would lead to. It puts strict limits on how much sugar can be imported without forcing Americans to pay taxes on those imports in the form of duties. It mandates that the government purchase excess sugar and then sell it at a loss to ethanol producers. All of these are features of the existing sugar policy, and all of them are left completely unchanged by this bill. So it is screaming for some amendments to provide some common sense reforms to this very badly flawed program. And by the way, let me be very clear. The net effect at the end of the day of all of these machinations in which the government manipulates the market for sugar is that U.S. consumers end up paying more, much more, often about double the going rate that everyone else in the world that doesn't manipulate their markets pays for sugar. Now, that should, by the way, that should be reason enough to end this program entirely, in my view. But there are other reasons. For instance, the existing sugar policy, that, as I say, unchanged in this bill, absolutely is costing us jobs in the United States. It's not even disputable. It is, on balance, a job killer. It is costing us jobs today, specifically jobs in manufacturing of products that include sugar, of which there are many. Here's a simple quote, an observation from the CEO of a candy manufacturer in Pennsylvania who uses sugar as an import. He points out that these sugar subsidies artificially inflate the price of one of the staples of the candy industry and forces us and any other companies to choose between absorbing the higher costs, passing the costs on to consumers, or producing elsewhere. Now, the fact is, some people inevitably choose to produce elsewhere. The next chart illustrates a point that's been made by the U.S. Department of Commerce. We're not just making these things up. Many U.S. essentially sugar-consuming producers, these manufacturers, have already closed or relocated to Canada, where sugar prices are less than half of the U.S. Why? Because Canada chooses not to have a ridiculous sugar program. And so we lose jobs as manufacturers go to Canada, use market-priced sugar at much lower cost to produce candies, and then import them into the United States. The next chart quantifies this. It's very simple. For every job that's protected somewhere where they're growing beets or cane sugar, 3 manufacturing jobs are lost. Again, these are statistics from the Department of Commerce. This is very clear. This is not really refutable. The final chart illustrates this in another way. The Canadian government has figured this out, and they advertise the fact that they have a huge competitive advantage because they choose not to create an artificially high price for sugar. As a result, they are constantly trying to persuade manufacturers to move up to Canada where they can have lower cost. And by the way, for many of these companies, the cost of the sugar in the United States is the single biggest cost that they pay. The other point that we should stress, that I would like to really underline, is not only do we lose jobs systematically because of this program, but it also hurts consumers. I mean, think about it. Everybody consumes sugar. There's sugar in so many products that it's absolutely impossible to avoid this inflated cost. And it should really be seen as equivalent to a tax. It's as though the federal government were imposing a tax on sugar. Doesn't work literally that way, but it has that economic effect. It's completely equivalent. And who gets hit the hardest by this? It's the lowest income Americans. It's as regressive a tax as you could possibly have. You think about it. Wealthy people devote a very, very small percentage of their total income to food. They have plenty of money they spend on many other things. But if you're a low-income American, then you necessarily are devoting a very large percentage of your income to food, and so much of it is artificially inflated in cost by our own federal government. This is what's so egregious about it. The GAO said in 2000 that the existing sugar policy forced Americans to pay $2 billion in additional food costs. And if you use their same methodology and you move it ahead to today, AEI projects that those costs are now $3.5 billion. This is a simple, straightforward transfer of wealth from low and middle income and ordinary American consumers to a handful of wealthy producers. It's as simple as that. Oh, but there's one other feature. There's also an ongoing risk to taxpayers. Because of that feature that I alluded to earlier, in which the federal government buys what is deemed to be excess sugar and then sells it at a loss to ethanol makers, CBO is projecting that this will lose $193 million for taxpayers over the next decade. Well, Mr. President, we have an amendment that it would address this. The Shaheen Amendment, and I think Senator Shaheen has actually offered more than one amendment on this topic. One would repeal the entire program. I salute her for this. I agree with her. I support that. My understanding is that we will soon be voting on a motion to table that. I think it's quite unfortunate that Senator Reid would choose to take this amendment off the table, so to speak, to put it aside. A vote to table the amendment, of course, is a vote to kill it. And so I think we ought to be passing this amendment and end the practice of forcing American consumers to transfer this wealth in this fashion. But I want to also stress that I'm concerned about the process that's gotten us here. I am concerned that Senator Reid has intentionally chosen an amendment that's going to be very difficult to pass. As strong as its merits are from my point of view, I know that it's difficult to get a majority in this body to support the full repeal of this program. I hope we can succeed in that, but I don't know that we can. If we cannot, Senator Shaheen has another amendment that I've joined her on, which would push back some of the excesses of this program, push us back to where we were back in 2008 prior to the most recent Farm Bill. They make some modest changes and just scales back some of these excesses. And I certainly hope that we get a chance to vote on that. If we can't pass full repeal, we have every right, I would argue every responsibility in this body, to try to at least improve on what is such an egregiously flawed program. Again, I would underscore the fact that the current bill is silent. In other words, it perpetuates, it continues this really spectacularly flawed program that is so unfair to American consumers. We will have an opportunity to vote later today on a motion to table. I hope we defeat the motion to table so that we can take up this bill and take up this amendment and do away with this program. But failing that, Mr. President, it's very, very important that we have an opportunity to at least amend the program. With that, I yield the floor.